Good evening and welcome to the webinar. We're going to wait just a few seconds to let a few more people filter in and then we'll get going. And hello and welcome to tonight's webinar, Nuclear Energy, Expensive Menace or Low Carbon Solution. My name is Fred Hewitt. I'm a member of 350 Massachusetts. This webinar is the first of three in a series entitled Evaluating Climate Solutions. The series has been organized in memory of Larry Rosenberg, a lifelong progressive activist and an early member of both 350 Massachusetts and the Mass chapter of Elders Climate Action. From his union organizing work to Central American solidarity efforts to advocating for climate action, Larry's insight and enduring commitment made him a consistent contributor to positive change. His professional career included jobs in writing software for wind farms, leading an anti-military weapon proliferation research team, and supporting health-focused international development projects. Larry lived with lymphoma for years, but in 2020, his illness took a more aggressive turn. He left us in May of 2022. He was highly principled, but also a pragmatist who cast a critical eye on technology. From my personal conversations with him, I know that although he had concerns about nuclear energy, he always kept an open mind. Tonight's webinar will explore some of the tough questions Larry had about nuclear technology. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Elizabeth Turnbull Henry. Elizabeth has been the president of the Environmental League of Massachusetts since 2017. Under her leadership, ELM has been a major force in the halls of the State House, helping to drive the passage of offshore wind legislation and other energy policy and environmental justice initiatives. She is a widely respected voice in climate and energy policy throughout the region, and I am delighted she has agreed to moderate tonight's discussion. A reminder to use the Q&A feature to pose your questions, and I will now turn it over to Elizabeth, who will be introducing our panelists. Elizabeth.
Thank you, Fred. It's really an honor to be together tonight, and I think fitting to honor Larry's legacy by discussing environmental issues, particularly nuclear. As I was reflecting on this event, I was just noticing that as temperatures are rising and anxiety is climbing about climate change, I think many people are re-examining their views on nuclear. In fact, it seems to me that all across the environmental movement, people are evaluating how they feel about both the fleet of existing power plants and the prospect of building new ones. So this feels like a really timely conversation. Massachusetts, of course, where I sit, where I think about all the time, has had a long history with nuclear energy. We've led on some significant innovations here out of our universities and companies, and the New England grid has depended on nuclear for decades. Currently, Seabrook and Millstone are still running here in New England. And for those of you following along with the ISO New England app here on your phone, right now, about 13% of the electrons coursing through our shared regional grid are coming from nuclear energy. So it's a part of the backbone that keeps our economy and grid going. But we've also seen some really hard challenges recently around decommissioning, including the Vermont Yankee and Pilgrim. Across the US, there are 93 reactors across 28 states operating today, and they provide about 20% of the nation's power. Nuclear, as I think we all know, is a complex issue, and luckily we have two really thoughtful guests tonight who are going to share their views and open a conversation on this topic. I want to introduce first Vick Mohanka, or Vick, who I'm really pleased to have known for many years. He's the acting chapter director of the Massachusetts Sierra Club. Prior, he worked on climate finance at the Chisholm Legacy Project and was an organizer for Clean Water Action. There, he worked with many on this call, leading the Mass Power Forward Coalition and directed Clean Water's electoral work. Some don't know that Vick was also a legislative staffer for the TUE committee, or the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee for the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Welcome, Vick. Also really pleased to welcome our second panelist, Kaylee Cunningham. Kaylee's a doctoral student in MIT's Nuclear Science and Engineering program. And Kaylee's developed a bit of a reputation, I think, as a social media influencer on this issue by generating educational videos and targeting nuclear misinformation on TikTok. You have tens of thousands of followers on your handle as Ms. Nuclear Energy, and have done kind of an amazing job branding and engaging with the public on this issue. Kaylee graduated from the University of Florida and has interned at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission before starting at MIT. One thing I love about your background, Kaylee, is that you won a prize for inventing a radiation shielding sports bra to prevent women who work in high-risk environments from developing breast cancer. So thoughtful, creative, two very thoughtful, creative panelists here, and I'm excited to get into it. Nuclear energy is an emotional and complicated topic, but unlike a nuclear reactor, the intent of our debate tonight is to create more light than heat. And Vick and Kaylee come from pretty different perspectives on this issue, and they both have a lot to add to the conversation. So we intend to make this a discussion. Fred and I will be monitoring the Q&A, and we'll do our best to be inclusive with your questions. I want to just outline what to expect for our time together. We'll give Vick and Haley several minutes each to state their perspectives, kind of an opening statement. I'll pose a few questions to each of them, and they're also very much, Vick and Kaylee, very much encouraged to engage with each other on these questions. And then we'll turn to audience questions to round out our time together. Vick and Kaylee will have a few minutes to make a closing statements if you've got them, and then Fred will close us out and take us home. So with that, why don't we start with you, Vick?
Hi, am I pinned? Is it good? Okay. I'm Vick Mohanka. Thank you for the introduction. I use he, him pronouns, currently the acting chapter director at the Massachusetts Sierra Club. And I'm calling in from the Boston region, which is the traditional land of the Massachusetts people. I'm really glad to be here today and talk about this really important issue. So Sierra Club has a strong stance against nuclear energy, and we've had one since the 1970s. I'm going to represent many of those positions, but I also want to say, I think the concept of nuclear energy is a great concept. You know, on paper, it's an elegant, low carbon, low harm technology with a lot of history. You know, as Elizabeth said, we're even using it still, but a lot of history of contributing to our electric grid, especially when you compare it to coal power. We are seeing that now that we've studied the effects from climate change and pollution, we could see that coal and natural gas are also not the answer, as I'm sure we can all agree. And I think if this were the 1960s, I actually would probably be on the other side of this argument. I think that nuclear fission generation would be the best alternative. We aren't in the 1960s, and you know, again, as Elizabeth said, we're building the biggest offshore wind farms in the world. We're leading the world in renewable energy in multiple ways. In the US, almost every single state has some sort of solar energy enabling policies. And if you look at the current energy generation, the existing nuclear fleet in America was not made for 2023. It was made for the 1970s and the 1980s. Every single plant, except for the one in Georgia, is basically running far past its planned operations. We have solutions for generating electricity. We have solutions for the climate crisis, and we know what direction that we want to go in for environmental and climate justice. What we don't have is a place to put nuclear waste. We don't have somewhere where we can raise the funds to pay for expensive new nuclear plants. And we don't have proven technology that we can implement to solve the current issues that our existing nuclear fleet has. We're going to hear a lot about tech like small modular nuclear reactors, the new generation of reactors and nuclear fusion, sorry. These are all ideas that are very viable on paper. I think that there's a lot of extremely smart scientists and people who are much more qualified to talk about the technology than I am. But what I would like to talk about is when we're looking at the scale of the climate crisis, when we're looking at the year that we're in, 2023, I don't think we have time to dedicate the resources to develop those new technologies if some of that energy and some of those resources could go towards the existing renewable energy solutions that are already in the implementation phase. We have turbines going in the ocean. We have panels on roofs. I'm not sure that we need to expend all of the billions and billions of dollars to create new nuclear power plants. Some of the other reasons, nuclear power, I'm sure most of you have heard, generates nuclear waste. We don't have somewhere in America to put nuclear waste. I do think that a solution might be possible, but right now we don't have a solution, and I don't want to advocate for generating more long-term nuclear waste when we don't have somewhere to put it. If you look at the nuclear power plants that we're trying to decommission, you can just look down in Cape Cod. You can look at Pilgrim. Pilgrim nuclear power plants decommissioning is extremely controversial. Sierra Club, Massachusetts, has taken a strong stance to hold the company Holtec accountable for the water that they want to release into the ocean and for the costs and the risks to the people around Cape Cod Bay and the larger region. Nuclear power also uses the same technology that fuels nuclear bombs. There's well-documented research just showing that it is the same technology and some of the same scientists, some of the same people, and there are real risks that we have when we encourage more nuclear fission technology. Nuclear power is risky. It's risky due to human error. We saw that with Chernobyl. It's risky to natural disasters like with Fukushima. And it's risky because of the climate crisis. The nuclear power plants that we have and are designing, where's the guarantee that they will be able to withstand, that they are fully ready for the challenges that a changing climate will bring, including bigger storms, floods, changing temperatures, etc. The last thing I'm going to say is a little bit more of a political argument. If we look at who nuclear power has helped and who it's hurt, I strongly believe that nuclear power as it exists has disproportionately harmed the indigenous people of Turtle Island, which is the term we use for North America. I think that other environmental justice communities have also taken strong stances against nuclear energy. If you look at the whole supply chain, you could look at from the extraction all the way through production, generation, and then decommissioning. If we commit to a nuclear future, we are committing to creating more sacrifice zones and harming the people who have the least power and the least resources to avoid those costs. I strongly believe that we need to respect and learn from Indigenous knowledge and look towards coalitions and groups, people like the Climate Justice Alliance, and see the stances of the folks who have been the most affected negatively from nuclear power. And I think that if we commit to a nuclear future, we need to put those voices first, because those are the ones who've paid the highest costs up until now. So that's my opening statement. Thank you, everyone. And I'm happy to begin the discussion.
Terrific. And thank you, Vic. And Kaylee, I want to welcome you to the stage here. You know, you've heard some of this before, and I'm curious. You've dedicated your professional career to nuclear and advocating for it, but you also seem really thoughtful about some of the risks and considerations. So curious what you would give as an opening statement here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all again for having me here. Excuse me. It's very exciting to see so many participants. Again, yes, my name is Kaylee Cunningham. I'm a PhD student at MIT studying nuclear science and engineering. And I have a bachelor's degree in nuclear science and engineering. And to kind of kick things off here, I want to start by acknowledging the fear and the concerns behind nuclear power. I think it is incredibly important and something my industry has not been good about communicating in recent years, and just historically throughout the industry over the past few decades, that the impact of the accidents we have seen has caused harm, right? The major accidents have caused harm to people's physical, mental, and emotional states. And that is something we need to be, as an industry, more transparent about and begin to acknowledge. Now, that being said, those fears do also have a tendency to kind of generate misinformation that has a tendency to spread, because when people are afraid and don't totally understand what's going on or the technology behind these accidents and this clean energy source, when there's that lack of understanding, we start to see more fear generate and more rumors propagate. And it turns into this really vicious cycle that seems to kind of attack this technology, when in reality, majority of problems facing the nuclear, I would say even plaguing the nuclear industry right now, are not technology problems, they are political problems. Now, to kind of kick things off here, a little bit more about nuclear energy. So those of you who maybe aren't as familiar, nuclear, I like to say, is essentially just fancy hot rocks that boil water, right? So we are using nuclear fuel that is typically uranium based, right? And there are these little gummy bear sized pellets that sit inside these long skinny metal fuel rods and sit in essentially a pool of water to keep them cool. And we have those rods standing next to each other. They start to heat up and get super excited, and that causes water to boil. And that boiling water generates steam, which turns a turbine and puts electrons on our electricity grid. Now, with this, something I would like to point out, I, throughout my undergraduate career and in selecting a major, and even throughout my high school years, I was fortunate enough to take several engineering classes where I was exposed to all the different electricity generation types and technologies that are out there, stemming from fossil fuels into wind and solar and more renewable technologies, and kind of propagating toward nuclear energy as the intersect between the two. Another thing I always like to throw out there, just as myself, something I very firmly believe is, at the end of the day, what I'm here to do is to fight climate change. And if nuclear energy turns out to not be the answer, that's okay. As long as we can find an answer to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions and actually make an impact on our environment. Now, a little bit more about nuclear from kind of these common misconceptions, and going back to a couple of the arguments that Vic had formed here. One of the first things I want to bring up is this term we call capacity factor. Capacity factor is essentially just a measure of how often a different technology can produce electricity. So from the time you turn it on to the time you turn it off, how much of that time are we producing electricity, putting electrons on the grid versus how much time do we have to have shut down, or are we unable to produce electricity? Now, nuclear power is known, and these are from the Department of Energy statistics as of 2021. Nuclear power has the highest capacity factor, even higher than fossil fuels, at 93%. Nuclear power can operate 93% of the year. Natural gas is only looking at 54%, and then we see coal at 49%. And although wind and solar are excellent technologies, the biggest problem, and the argument I'm sure you've heard, is the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. Especially with solar power up here in New England, we have long winters, we don't see the sun very often, and that contributes to lower capacity factors, which means less electricity, which means we need electricity to come from somewhere else. So the capacity factor for wind power is only 35%. So only 35% of the time we can actually extract electricity. And solar is even lower than that at 25%. So that is kind of argument point number one. Nuclear can operate 93% of the time. It is reliable and it is not weather dependent, and it is a carbon emission free technology. Now, to touch a little bit on the waste. Nuclear waste, it is a problem, but it is far from a technology or technological problem, and very much a political problem that we have seen. Now, the first thing a lot of people are unaware of is that we can actually recycle or reuse nuclear waste through this process that we call reprocessing. So we take spent or used nuclear fuel and put it inside another reactor, and we can transmutate it to create more nuclear fuel. One of my professors from the University of Florida has conveyed this by his sort of analogy, is that what we're doing right now is taking one bite out of a Snickers bar and throwing the rest in the trash can. That's essentially how much energy we are using from the nuclear fuel without reprocessing it. So there's a lot more energy we could be extracting. Now, another point to kind of throw in here is that the amount of nuclear waste we have produced since we started producing nuclear waste, commercial nuclear energy waste, would fit inside a football field at a depth of 10 yards. All the waste we have ever created in the United States, ever, from all the 92, 93 nuclear power plants we have operating in the US, all of that waste fits inside a football field. That's because nuclear power is so energetically dense. You produce so much more energy for such a small amount of fuel. One fuel pellet, one uranium UO2 fuel pellet can produce as much as several hundred barrels of oil and several thousand pounds of natural gas. It is mind-blowing to know the amount of energy that is harnessed in just this one little tiny fuel pellet. Now, the other component to all of this is storing the waste, right? So right now, Vick has kind of alluded to, what do we do with it? We don't have a place to put it. Right now, that nuclear fuel, spent nuclear fuel or used nuclear fuel that we refer to as waste, is sitting in these giant casks that are basically like giant tin cans, except they're not tin, they're much stronger than that, but they're giant cylinders that are containing all the nuclear fuel, and they sit on nuclear power plant sites currently. We could be using that fuel and recycling it and moving forward, but the United States has found that it's less expensive to just keep mining for new uranium. So we have yet to pursue reprocessing. When it comes to a long-term storage facility, we have the technology. We've had the technology and the science and the plans to implement this since the 1960s and 1970s. The unfortunate reality is that when we see science kind of intersect with messy politics, we start to see misinformation spread and unfortunate things happen, and we end up with scenarios like Yucca Mountain. Those of you who maybe haven't heard of Yucca Mountain, it was supposed to be a long-term storage facility for nuclear fuel, and it was selected, unfortunately, without any characterization by the government. And you guys can check out my TikTok page. I don't want to go on too long in the interest of time. Happy to cover that if you guys are interested and have questions and want me to tell that story. But as a result, we saw all this money being poured into constructing a spent nuclear fuel storage facility in a place that is not technologically capable of storing nuclear fuel. And so all of the scientists and engineers from my side of things were essentially just gritting their teeth and rolling their eyes and trying to tell people, stop, this is not right. This is not how we do this. It's really just an unfortunate story. And then we see the kind of invasion of indigenous properties. Another thing that Vic alluded to, which again is not the technology's fault, but is very, very much the way that the technology was handled by the government. Now, with that, the Department of Energy is pushing forward right now with a consent-based siting initiative. This initiative is focused on finding communities that will consent to and support having a spent nuclear fuel storage facility in their geographical area. Now, in doing so, the hope is to introduce new jobs to economic areas or, underserved or underprivileged economic areas, introduce new jobs, new financial kind of repercussions and things like that, positive things for the economy, for these areas, but also avoid infringing on these indigenous properties and this indigenous land. And essentially the goal is to try and mitigate that conflict. Again, because we have the technology, it's just a matter of figuring out the politics behind it. Now, jumping back over, I know Vic mentioned very briefly the accidents that we've seen. All of the accidents that we've seen are outside of the US. The one accident that we saw in the United States was the 3 Mile Island incident, which in my opinion is a perfect demonstration of how successful the United States regulatory body is and safety systems are. The US has what we call containment structures that are intended to, and in the 3 Mile Island accident, successfully did contain any radioactive material so that the release to the environment is negligible and nobody gets hurt, and we can safely operate this technology. And then to touch on the decommissioning problems, going back to the waste, if we look at the decommissioning technologies, more recently we've seen the Fukushima discharges into of their wastewater, which technically isn't wastewater, is just contaminated water that's been discharged after treatment into the ocean. The Plymouth nuclear power plant, Pilgrim nuclear power plant, is interested in doing something similar with the wastewater or contaminated water that they also have. This system that Fukushima sort of developed and Japan developed in conjunction with the world's technological experts focuses on filtering out all the long-lasting radioactive products and leaving a very, very small amount of tritium in the water, which we can talk about later if people have questions, but it's just fancy hydrogen. Essentially leaving this water to the point where you would have to drink 8 gallons to just get the radiation dose you would get from eating 1 banana, which we do all the time. Sometimes I eat 2 bananas in a day. So those kinds of things are general technology misconceptions that I myself and a lot of people in the nuclear industry now are starting to try and communicate and introduce these technical understandings to help dispel a lot of these fears and regain some confidence with the general public and build more trust with the general public about and with nuclear technology as a whole. So overall, I think I'm over on time, so we'll turn it back to Elizabeth.
All right, thank you. And we can bring Vic up here as well. So thank you, Kaylee. Thank you, Vic. Vic, I want to turn to you for a question. Germany was an interesting example of a country that that chose to decommission a lot of their nuclear fleet, and then has been criticized by some because of that decommissioning has led to an increase in the combustion of fuel like oil and gas. I'm curious in this case if you think Germany made the right choice, and sort of as a corollary, how are you thinking about the existing nuclear fleet here in New England and whether to keep it online to hasten its decommissioning, or maybe even give it subsidies to stay operational in perpetuity?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. I think the Germany example is complicated. I do think we live in a slightly different world than we did when Germany decided to make those decisions initially. If you just look at the availability of renewable energy products. I also think that there's definitely a lack of I think we need to go through our like fundamentals when we're talking about the climate crisis in terms of like reducing, reusing, and recycling. And number one, reducing. I think that when we talk about these things, we talk as if the energy demands that, especially more developed, like Western European, or like America, like more developed countries have. I just think there isn't as much of a focus on the demand side. I think the generation side is what we talk about as if demand is static and we can't change that. A lot of the energy that we do consume, I'm not convinced that we have to. So I think there's some there's like a missing piece in the most effective choices that we can make from an economic and a climate standpoint. Obviously, the Germany example is not a great look for the anti-nuclear folks who also want to see coal and gas decrease. And then, sorry, what was the second part again?
Yeah, I want to return to this notion of demand management maybe a little bit later in the conversation. But we live in a 6-state regional grid that has 2 big nuclear facilities at Seabrook and Millbrook in Connecticut. I'm curious how you're thinking about those. Obviously, Seabrook just got its relicensing. It's going to be chugging along until 2050, barring the unforeseen. The Connecticut plant will have its relicensing more sooner. But I'm curious how you're thinking about those existing assets and whether you would be advocating for them to be decommissioned at the end of their license.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they should have been decommissioned at the end of their original license. I don't think that we should just extend these in perpetuity. I also think that we do have a lot of resources coming onto the grid, especially in terms of offshore wind. I mean, if you look at the capacity factor issue, we do have answers for that. We do have different ways of storing, transmitting electricity. I don't think that nuclear is the solution for the capacity factor issue, especially if you look at the current energy resources that they're building peaking power plants. They're building natural gas. Nuclear energy will not be a peaking technology. So peaking is like when we have the a very hot day like today, and there's extra load on the grid. They turn on resources that aren't always on to meet that demand. A lot of the costs of our grid are because of that peaking energy. It's the least efficient. It's the most carbon intensive energy that we have. And adding more base load energy, which is the energy that's on 24/7, isn't actually going to fix that. The solar and wind that we do have, especially the solar, it's not really going anywhere, and it needs another resource or storage to fix that peaking issue. So I don't think that we actually, like personally, I don't think that we need Seabrook and Millbrook on the New England grid. I think in a lot of ways, they do make our emissions numbers look better, but I also think that carbon emissions is not the whole picture. If we look at continuing operations of Seabrook and Millbrook, a lot of folks aren't taking into account the costs of decommissioning, or what that process will look like, or how long that'll take, and what kind of costs that the public will bear to decommission those plants. It's not factored in, when they bid into ISO right now. They might say it is, but history kind of shows differently.
And so I want to press you on that a little bit. And I misspoke. It's Millstone, not Millbrook. I lost the word there for a minute. I mean, experts estimate that we are going to need to somewhere between double and quadruple the size of the New England grid by 2050 if we're going to be decarbonizing our economy and electrifying most end uses that are currently powered by fossil fuels. That is an enormous lift. And that's a huge deployment of offshore wind and solar, upwards of 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, and many years of solar. I wonder, I know that keeps me up at night, the scale of that deployment, and and I wonder how that feels, or if you think Sierra Club might be changing their point of view on this question 10 or 15 years down the road. I mean, do you think we're deploying fast enough to hit those, to be able to ring that bell in 2050 that we've made it?
I mean, I would ask the question, are we on a pathway to build safe and reliable nuclear facilities to meet that, if you look at how long they take right now to build? So if we just look at what current technologies are being implemented, I would want to focus on the ones that are currently growing, rather than kind of shifting our attention to something that might be cost effective or might be big enough. Just look at the issues of siting. Could you imagine siting a new, nuclear power plant in New England? We can't. I mean, we have trouble siting small projects. We have trouble siting transmission lines to Quebec and Canada. I think the political problems, are distinct from the technological issues, but I don't see the political problems as something that's particularly solvable. And I think when we say political problems, that's a euphemism for saying the disproportionate costs borne by some communities and not others.
I think that's a nice segue here to a question to you, Kaylee, about siting and social license.
Before we move on to that, sorry, can I just respond to
please.
a couple of these? Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
No, I'm sorry. I see your hand. Yes, please.
So I just wanted to respond here with, first off, introducing offshore wind. Although it is an excellent technology, I am not anti-wind and solar in the slightest. But it is something to keep in mind that because we are offshore, our transmission costs are going to rise. And so the further we are transmitting power, the more expensive we see our electricity prices going up and increasing. Something else I wanted to bring up when we're talking about decommissioning nuclear power plants and choosing to shut them down. First off, the reason their licenses are being extended is because they've been operating safely for decades. And seeing these licenses become extended is just more and more positive feedback to see, because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that regulates these things and determines these licenses and how long nuclear reactors can operate for has some of the strictest requirements among any industry, not only in the United States, but also in the world. So to see their approval for extension of lifetime means we are seeing clean electricity for not just 50 or 60 years, but upwards of 80 and maybe even 100 years of carbon-free electricity. Now, when you shut down a nuclear power plant, a lot of times, and kind of what we saw Germany struggling with, is that shutting down that nuclear power plant is taking a massive amount of electricity off of the grid because of that insane power density I was talking about before in those little tiny fuel pellets. So, for example, one wind farm can produce on average about 8 megawatts of electricity. That's 10 to the 6, a million megawatts of electricity. Whereas one nuclear reactor can produce upwards of a gigawatt, or 10 to the power of 9 watts of electricity. So it is just a much, much larger amount of electricity. So when we remove that and decommission that, we need that much more, that many more renewables that we need to take their place. And to build off of that, going into load following, one of the things I wanted to mention is that nuclear actually is capable and does conduct load following. Different nuclear power plants at different locations.
Kaylee, just describe, when you say load following, you're talking about an ability to ramp up and ramp down?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah. I thought Vic had described that previously, but in terms of meeting electricity demands at midday in the summertime, like today, it was very, very warm. More and more people want to turn on air conditioning or plug in their window air conditioners up here. To do that and to meet those ramp ups and ramp downs in electricity demands, nuclear reactors are capable of doing that today, our current fleet. But something else I wanted to bring up is TerraPower's Natrium reactor design, which they've just submitted their NRC siting license approval for in Wyoming. They've already selected the site out there. That reactor design will be the first of its kind, but the way that it works is it contains what they call a molten salt thermal storage system. So basically, that just means it's a very fancy heat storage system so that the nuclear reactor can continue to operate alongside and in conjunction with wind and solar. And when that wind and solar kind of starts to ramp down, we see, maybe it's nighttime where people are coming home, electricity demands are increasing, but the sun is down, so we can't use any more solar, and maybe it's not a windy day, so we can't use any more wind. With that, we can turn to the extra process heat that the nuclear reactor has produced that's being stored in this fancy thermal storage system and extract that from the thermal storage system to meet those increasing demands. It is really an ingenious design, and the technology this reactor is based off of is technology that's been around since the 1960s. This advanced reactor design was invented, and we had and operated one in the 1960s. It's just a matter of bringing that design back to life.
So, Kaylee, maybe we've talked some about what to do about the existing fleet and whether to keep them on, extend their licenses, ramp them down. I want to talk about new stuff, because you've alluded to some of these fourth generation reactors. And I also want to pick up on this thread about siting. Many of us think in a sort of Massachusetts and New England context where siting is a bear. All right, it's hard to site even a substation, much less a nuclear facility. And you have communities fighting the building of solar in their towns, right? So the notion, the energy from these reactors is dense, and so is the opposition, right? So should we even be talking about this? Like, can nuclear in 2023 get the social license to operate in a place, particularly like New England, that is as densely populated and as bristling with NIMBY energy as it seems to be? I mean, do you think we'll site a nuclear facility in New England in before 2050?
One of the first things to bring up there, how many times am I going to say one of the first things? But I like to bring up what a lot of people don't know is in the heart of Cambridge, a very densely packed city, there is a nuclear reactor. MIT does have a nuclear reactor on campus. Now, this is a research reactor, so we don't use it to generate electricity, but we have the same technology with the same nuclear fuel, actually a little bit more radioactive nuclear fuel for our experiments, and it operates perfectly safely and has had the license and the site. So granted, the siting was done quite a while ago. The reactor is fresh out of the 1970s. So, or maybe 60s, late 60s, early 70s. That being said, it is possible. And something I will throw out there, and a reason why I think it's important to keep nuclear as a part of the discussion and a part of the conversation is, first off, nuclear is very, very compact. It does not take up a lot of space. Wind farms and solar panels and solar farms take up a lot of geographical space that we don't necessarily have in this state. Nuclear takes up a fraction of that amount of space and produces significantly more electricity, which is something we very desperately need. Now, that being said, do I think the NRC is going to write a siting license for Massachusetts tomorrow? No. I do think, however, as we progress and move forward and we see nuclear sprout up and kind of become more and more accessible throughout the rest of the country, we need to keep in mind that nuclear is going to be a part of the climate change solution in other places. And as a result, I think it's important that Massachusetts as a state stays educated and up to date on these topics as well, even if it doesn't mean we're putting a nuclear reactor here tomorrow, but just to be aware and to be educated of what else is happening in our country.
There's a question in the Q&A that I love, Kaylee, and I'm wondering if you can briefly address it. And the question is essentially, are the fourth generation reactors going to address the challenges, the issues that so many of us had with nuclear in earlier generations? Can you briefly answer that?
Absolutely. There's so many different sort of aspects here that I could touch on. But to start with, I didn't get a chance to mention in the introduction the weapons, the non-proliferation, that technology. That is something people have been very, very concerned about, especially since the 1970s. And so looking at these advanced reactor designs, which again, all of these advanced reactor designs are designs that we have built and operated back in the 60s. We're just kind of bringing these designs back to life. Now, looking at specifically the high temperature gas cooled reactor, HTGR for short, it's a fancy type of nuclear reactor that can operate on a special type of fuel that we call particle form fuel. This is commonly referred to as TRISO or triisotropic fuel. But really what that means is if you think of an M&M cookie, right? And we look at a little chocolate M&M, okay? At the center of that M&M, there's a piece of chocolate, and that chocolate is representative of the uranium in the triso particle. Then the next layer surrounding that little uranium fuel kernel is going to be some sort of protective shell that we make of things like silicon carbide or super, super strong and excellent thermally conductive materials. So it just kind of acts as a shell to protect that fuel. And then we put a few more layers around it, kind of like the colored coating that goes over the hard candy shell to protect it. And then those little tiny M&Ms get baked inside or rolled up inside cookie dough. And that cookie dough is representative of what we call material matrix, which is typically something like carbon that we kind of bake these little M&M fuel particles into. And then that fuel we can either make into a ball, right? And have that be what we call a pebble for a pebble bed HTGR, high temperature gas cooled reactor, or we can press them into the standard little cylinder composites that, you know, we call the fuel composites. So that fuel form, this particle fuel form, like M&M cookie style kind of thing, is next to impossible to extract spent nuclear fuel from for weapons proliferation. So again, this technology, we know how to do it. Several companies are making this fuel today, right now, and we've used it in the past. We can use it again. So that is one of the big things that these advanced reactor, fourth generation reactors address, looking at weapons proliferation and concern of exposure to spent nuclear material or special nuclear material. Now, some of the other things that advanced reactors, but as well, current nuclear reactors have been retrofitted to include are things like we call passive safety systems. So sounds counterintuitive because you want your safety system to not be passive, but after the Fukushima accident, where we saw an electricity failure or a pump failure cause a meltdown because we couldn't circulate water through the nuclear reactor to keep it cool, kind of like when you have a pan on the stove, but you shut the stove off and the pan is still hot. The nuclear reactor is the same way. We want to run water through it to keep it cool because it stays hot even after you turn it off. Now, when the power went out after the tsunami hit at the Fukushima accident, we saw flooding in the basement of some of the nuclear power plant facilities, which flooded their diesel-powered backup generators and caused the accident. Nowadays, these new designs, as well as old nuclear power plants that are still operating, implement what we call these passive safety systems that rely on things like convection currents. So the way water moves when you boil water on the stove in a pot, those convection currents are what circulate and flow water through the nuclear reactor to keep it cool. So we don't have to rely on pumps or electricity. And what happened at Fukushima is physically impossible to happen again. So things like this we're incorporating to make sure not only these new advanced reactors, but also past reactors are incredibly, incredibly safe and hopefully address some of those concerns.
Well, based on the Q&A, I do see a lot of questions about safety and waste. I think those are going to be persistent challenges for the nuclear industry to address. Vic, I had a question for you here. I get Bill McKibben's Substack, his newsletter, as probably many folks do, and I was struck by the most recent newsletter, which references University of Chicago data, and that the average person in Southeast Asia has a lifespan that's statistically 5 years shorter because of inhaling particulate pollution from the combustion of fossil fuels. And you look similarly at the renewable deployment curves in those countries, and we're not seeing anything that matches, any sort of net zero by 2050. I'm curious if you think renewable energy can address these issues of air quality fast enough, or if there are instances where you would consider deploying these maybe fourth generation reactors in countries that are really suffering from air quality issues.
Yeah, I think that's a very tricky question to get into. I do like to kind of look at Massachusetts and our grid because that's where we live, that's where we work. I don't think most of us haven't really spent a lot of time working on the Southeast Asian energy grid. But I guess I'll say I don't, it's not that I would rule out nuclear under any circumstances. I think given the political realities, given where the public is, and given the stage of the technology, as well as the economics, I think it's the confluence of factors that say this is not something that we should, we can't treat it as if it's at the same stage as renewable energy. Renewable energy is being deployed right now. The new generation of nuclear reactors is not being deployed. It's not being scaled up. There aren't factories for new nuclear reactors, the small modular nuclear reactors. I've seen some proposals for it. I'm a little bit of a skeptic, but yeah, I don't, I would not want to rule it out. I would just say that, if the problem is fossil fuels, I don't think that we have to jump towards nuclear energy as a solution. I think it's enough to just say that fossil fuel pollution is reducing people's lifespans, and we need to look at anything we could do to reduce fossil fuel use. I don't have as much knowledge about Southeast Asia. I know a little bit more about the country I have heritage in, India, the South Asian subcontinent. And if you look at the systems in place, it's actually, there's a lot of pollution that is caused for similar reasons as in America, with, you know, focus on car culture and needing to use internal combustion engines to get to work, to do your daily activities. You know, I hop in a car to go places all the time. I don't really have a choice to use the MBTA. Are we talking about switching cars to nuclear energy or switching the MBTA to generate their own nuclear energy? Not really. The conversation is about how to reduce fossil fuel use. I see that as kind of a separate issue than generating the renewable energy. And I think that this is kind of borne out as renewable energy comes online. The hope that we all have is that it is a replacement for fossil fuels. But right now, these kinds of technologies aren't a one-to-one replacement for fossil fuels. We need to be talking about different kinds of system changes to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels in general. I'm not sure that nuclear energy or renewable energy would completely replace that broken system in the first place.
Kayla, do you want to briefly respond?
Yeah, please. Now, when it comes to looking at reducing fossil fuels, I think that is the number one thing we are all in agreement on. Now, obviously, maybe not so obviously, but from my background and my perspective, nobody's looking to create nuclear powered cars anytime soon or transportation. But the real question is, more and more of us are pushing towards electric vehicles and electric cars. And in doing so, we are increasing electricity demands. And that increase in demand, all that electricity has to come from somewhere. And if, you know, the thing to keep in mind is that long-term storage for wind and solar are not as far along. They're just as far off in technological development as is most of these advanced, or at least the small modular reactors are. And so maybe not in construction time, but in technological development, they're certainly comparable. And so something to keep in mind here is just that the sort of looking at where this electricity is going to come from with the increased demands, wind and solar, we can't necessarily rely on. And that was demonstrated by Germany. That is being demonstrated regularly by California with rolling blackouts and the concerns switching to more wind and solar power and a lot of the issues they've seen there. And that was part of the reason that the state decided to keep Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant open, to keep that electricity there. So at the end of the day, we're reaching a point where electricity is becoming a human need, right? We need it for food, we need it for water, we need it for air conditioning, heating, whatever it may be. I guess maybe not so much up here in the Northeast for heating, but that it's just something to keep in mind.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
So Kaylee, MIT has been the home of a lot of innovation on nuclear, and increasingly a lot of innovation on fusion. We've got 58 questions here in the Q&A, and several of them are on fusion. I know, not to editorialize, but I'm like enthralled by what's happening in the plasma lab at MIT and at Commonwealth Fusion. I'm curious what your take is on the progression toward commercial fusion, and do we need fission in a world where fusion is commercialized?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I, having worked on the last year a Commonwealth Fusion project, and been in that exciting innovation-driven Plasma Science and Fusion Center at MIT, it is so exciting to see how far along fusion is starting to progress. I think we have made more major milestones and achieved more milestones in the last few years than we have in decades. That being said, I think fission and fusion communities really need to work together right now. for the point in that fusion is still going to have waste. I think that's what a lot of people forget, and maybe those who are more focused on the physics work behind fusion have this kind of misconception that, oh yeah, don't worry about it, there's no waste, there's no waste. But being someone who works on the material science side of things, these structural materials are likely to become activated and create more nuclear waste. So the same waste problem we have that we're dealing with in the fusion community is still going to have to take on. The waste might be reduced, the amount of waste that's produced, but it is still waste that needs to be handled and treated safely. That being said, I think fusion is kind of on the rise in the sense of regulatory requirements. Fusion is still being licensed in the same way that research reactors, like the one on MIT, or I saw your comment, UMass Lowell's campus, those research reactors have a little bit less extensive licensing requirements than these commercial nuclear power plants.
Yeah, and I know the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has made some decisions that it's going to make it a lot easier for fusion.
Exactly.
I want to really press on the fusion versus fission waste issue though, because I think we're talking about something that's really categorically different. I mean, when you were using uranium, you are creating byproducts that have half-lives in the tens of thousands we are tens of thousands of years. My understanding from the fusion reactors is we're looking at, small amounts of tritium that are in half-lives of like the 10 to 20 year range. And you're the expert, not me, but I think, and significantly smaller quantities. So, I just, maybe you can just briefly frame for our audience, what are we talking about here in terms of the scale of waste? Because a lot of us have a lot of learning to do about fusion if we're actually going to have a breakthrough and commercialize.
Yeah. So something here is that the waste from fusion is significant because it's largely dependent on the structural materials that the reactor is made out of. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the standard tokamak, which is the technical term, fusion reactor design is kind of like a donut shape where we take plasma, which think like the sun, hot, fiery plasma, and we suspend it using magnets kind of inside this donut shaped structure. And that donut shaped structure and the remaining components around it need to hold or maintain this plasma, which is essentially the sun that we are making here on Earth. As you can imagine, that's very, very hot temperature-wise, but from a radiation standpoint, we are dealing with neutrons significantly faster and more energetic than fission has ever seen. The neutrons coming off of fission are a lot slower and have a lot less energy, right? In the kind of 1 million electron volt range, which I know doesn't mean much, but comparing that to a 14 million electron volt range for fusion. Now, because these neutrons have so much energy, we don't fully understand what they're going to do to the materials that are holding this plasma. And we're trying and working very hard to understand that at MIT right now. But depending on the best material that is selected, different elements respond to neutrons in different ways and become more activated and can become that long-lived, several hundreds of years waste that is radioactive for a very long time. There are materials that we might be able to engineer to work that only last maybe 10 to 20 years. And then we're only dealing with this sort of tritium breeding situation that Elizabeth mentioned. So there's kind of this, I guess, one way or the other. And I think it really just, nobody knows the answer to that right now. It's really dependent on where the science goes.
I think it's fair to say that proliferation concerns are significantly reduced in a fusion scenario than a fission scenario.
Yes.
Vic, how's Sierra Club thinking about fusion?
That is a great question. I think so. The Sierra Club policy is not opposed to these research facilities. I think developing science, developing new technologies, that's almost always worth our time. I think what we're talking about here is, in a public policy sense, what kinds of policies past the R&D stage are we talking about for nuclear fusion, right? Are we going to shut down a nuclear power plant and replace it with a fusion reactor anytime soon? It's hard to say. I don't know if anybody has an accurate timeline on what the commercialization of nuclear fusion will be. So I think that's like the main point. I love science fiction and I love technology. I read all these whenever NASA sends a new thing to space, I read all about it. I think that the benefits to society for scientific research is massive. The amount of information that we get from experimental reactors can help us in multiple fields. It's not just something that helps us. The benefits aren't just the direct benefits. You have also the indirect benefits for R&D spending. So we totally support doing the science and developing the technology. I think in terms of the actual public policy, in terms of solving climate change, is nuclear fusion something that could eventually be part of the equation? Yes. In terms of policies that we're going to be doing in the next 2 years, 5 years, maybe even 10 years, are they going to actually take into account nuclear fusion? Not really. And if we look at the climate crisis, we are suffering consequences now. We're suffering consequences that are compounding. They're going to get worse in 10 years. So we don't really have the time to sit around and wait for nuclear fusion. We don't have the time to say, what is something that could reduce the carbon intensity of our energy grid 100 years from now? I also just wanted to, I thought something Kaylee said about the nuclear fusion reactors was really great, about how we don't actually know the full effect on the materials around the reaction itself. This is a similar, I saw a bunch of questions about this with the nuclear wastewater at Fukushima and Pilgrim, how you'd have to drink like your body weight to get the radiation dose of an X-ray or something. Yeah, that totally is true. The science backs that up. I think what we're posing is not that somebody's going to go swimming and get radiation poisoning from the wastewater that's released. I think the question is, we don't know the full environmental effects of that volume of wastewater going into the ocean. How is that going to affect the ecosystem? Oceans are incredibly complicated. They're warming up, they're acidifying, we're having mass die-offs, and we're polluting the ocean in multiple ways. Do we want to pollute the ocean in another way when we have the choice not to? And then one other thing that I was reading a little bit about was high burnup nuclear waste fuel, or high burnup fuel. I don't know what the technical term is, Kelly, but I think for a lot of the nuclear waste that we have, we can look at the volume of it, we can look at the containers, but the actual monitoring of the safety and then the long-term effects, we actually don't know for certain if the long-term storage solution, if the storage solutions we have in place are going to be the long-term storage solutions. And every time we scale up, we have to get bigger and bigger containers to contain all the containers that were activated or become radioactive through it. So I think there's just a lot of questions. We have really long half-lives, and the timescales that we're talking about are not human timescales, let alone political timescales. So I'm concerned that we don't have the systems in place that can actually address these in a way that's good for society.
The half-life of a politician, Vic. I like that image. We've got 20 minutes left, and there are a lot of issues that I'd love to cover. So Kaylee, why don't you briefly respond to that, and then we're going to cook on a whole bunch of juicy topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So just super quickly, I will say over the last 12 years since the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident, there have been marine scientists and nuclear scientists collaborating through the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, to understand and ensure that the water from the Japan accident is in no way, shape, or form impacting marine life, because the water that we're putting in has a lower tritium count than the water we took out. So that is something to keep in mind there. I will just say I can kind of echo what Vic said with fusion. There's a lot that we just don't know. I think long term fusion, once we get there, it will be an incredible technology and it will be revolutionary. I just don't know if we're there yet. And there's plenty of people that agree and just don't know when it's going to happen.
So for those listening, the word Ukraine shows up a lot in these questions and answers. I think many of us were riveted in horror to watching the Russians taking over the Ukrainian nuclear facility, and concerns about just how vulnerable our power grid is and our populations are in the case of some terrorist attacks or military intervention. Hubert Murray asks, listen, capital intensive technologies lead to centralized siting and extensive distribution. Can the panelists discuss a more distributed model for electricity generation? And so Kaylee, I'd love to hear, what does it look like if we have a whole bunch of these small modular reactors sprinkled around? And what does that mean for national security and terrorism?
Yeah, no, these are fantastic questions and very, very real concerns. And so small modular reactors are kind of the buzzword we hear right now. And what that means from a science perspective, we're taking the same light water nuclear reactor that we have currently existing in our current fleet, and we're just shrinking it down in size. So the idea here is that smaller nuclear power plants that we can have several of in one facility is going to reduce size, will allow for these theoretically proposed, like Vic mentioned, kind of nuclear part manufacturing plants, and introduce these nuclear power plants scattered all over the country. The idea is, again, to drive down costs and make nuclear more affordable and more accessible. And in doing so, also introduces a lot more redundancy of systems and reduces required manpower at the nuclear power plant sites. But then we run into all of these security concerns, right? And for one thing, what I can tell you is I was just at Idaho National Laboratories modeling and experimentation validation school, where they exposed us to all of the new and advanced security systems that they are implementing from the cybersecurity perspective. That is something they are taking very real and very seriously, because cyber threats are legitimate and sometimes more common and more expected than these kind of posed terrorist threats. We do, for all the current nuclear power plants and future nuclear power plants, the NRC, or Nuclear Regulatory Commission, does require that these facilities are strong enough to withstand a plane crash. So any sort of attacks or weapons or things like that in the US is less of a risk. And then the security at these plants is very, very extensive. I worked at one for a little while with BWX Technologies, where they actually make nuclear reactors for the Navy and manufacture them. And going into the security sites, you have your car searched. There's all kinds of soldier-looking guys up on fences and watchtower. The security is just overwhelming at these places. So they are things to keep in mind, but at the end of the day, I think cyber is going to be a bigger threat and something that is a very active and intense field of research right now.
Cyber imperiling nuclear facilities.
Yes.
Rather than like a physical or bomb or something.
Exactly.
Vic, do you want to weigh in on war and violence, cyber?
Not really, that covered it. Yeah, I mean, it's scary stuff. These are like extremely dangerous situations. And something else that I think I didn't see in the Q&A as much is the correlation between the climate crisis and conflict. This isn't something that is going to go away, you know? And I think we saw that with the Ukraine conflict. And I think we live in a world where the future is uncertain. And do we want to be setting up more opportunities for danger, or do we want to shift towards a more decentralized, less risky system of energy production?
But I guess the follow-up to that is, what's more risky, having weather-dependent energy technologies or having reliable energy 24/7? They're all very good questions that I do not have the answers to.
There's a whole sub-thread of Q&A folks who are advocating for storage here and wanting to make sure that the promise of storage is reflected in this conversation, lithium ion or some of these long duration storage technologies here at home, pumped hydro, or what's happening at Form Energy with the, the rusting and unrusting. You seem to downplay the potential for storage technologies to match and meet the intermittence of renewables. Kaylee, you want to talk a little bit about that and why you feel that way?
Yeah, I think it's really just because, for one thing, mining for the minerals and elements we need to create these batteries is very, very bad for the environment. We still use
uranium mining, by the way. Uranium mining has some downsides too.
Uranium mining does, but the way uranium mining has been introduced more recently is through this sort of in situ leaching technique, where it's non-invasive and we're kind of just sucking it out of the ground. It's kind of a weird, like a leech on, on your skin technology, but it's much, much cleaner for the environment. And it has to do, I'm not an expert in that in any way, shape, or form, but it has to do with the sort of like natural abundance of different elements in the Earth's crust. And we do see a lot of, still open pit mining for these sort of lithium and other elements we need for these batteries. And the other thing to keep in mind is the lifespan of these batteries, right? They don't last forever. I'm not an expert. I don't know how long they last. I believe it's on the order of 5 to 8 years, but it's still a concern. And if we're using them to power things like electric cars, then we're going to need a lot more of them. And the way people go through cars and consume things in our country can be a little worrisome. But going back to the storage side of things, storage, the technology is under development, and these new molten salt technologies that I mentioned before that TerraPower is exploring with their Natrium reactor is a thermal storage solution that I don't know if it works with wind and solar, but I digress. There are storage solutions out there, but long-term and large capacity storage solutions still have some catching up to do technologically.
So Vic, obviously you've thought a lot about storage. Curious what you would say to that question.
Yeah.
Is there enough? Can it match the deployment of renewables?
I think, all right. I think there's like a little bit of hubris here in humans thinking that we can actually fully understand the systems in which we operate. So is it possible that we will have enough storage for renewables? Yes. Do we know the future? Do we understand how that switch would happen? Do we know what a carbon-free grid would look like? Not really, right? We just don't know. We don't know what limit, how much renewables on the current grid we could fit, before it starts overloading the grid and we have to do more curtailment, which is just turning off the power plants, basically. So I feel like some of these questions are putting the cart before the horse. We're looking at the end state when it's about the journey and the the choices and the allies we make along the way. So I'll just say, I think we have to focus on what's in front of us, which is a world where we need to desperately add storage capacity. We need to add renewable capacity as fast as possible. And these are the technologies that are ready to go. And at the same time, we need to be a lot smarter about how we consume electricity. If we go on the ISO app that you shared, Elizabeth, you could see our energy load goes up and down by a huge amount. Folks who are energy nerds will hear about terms like load factor and things like that. But basically, at the end of the day, our whole grid is not made for the 21st century. So I don't feel comfortable making like an engineering assessment, like, will we have enough storage to store all of the daily or weekly capacity of renewable intermittent generation? It's just a very complicated question, I think. And if we look at batteries in cars, those are actually energy storage already. It's not a one-way relationship there. Those cars can be backup energy for houses. So if you have a grid where you have a house with solar panels, all electric appliances, and then 2 electric vehicles, you already have 2 batteries sitting in the driveway. So how much extra storage capacity would we need in that world? And that's just looking at one model of a single family residence. And there's all sorts of other models out there and a lot of other efficiencies that we can gain, like the geo micro districts, if folks have heard about, neighborhood heating and cooling, which we're piloting in Massachusetts. So I think it's tough to answer questions like that, assuming we'll know what the future holds for us. I'm looking at what are the political choices that we're making right now to put us in the best situation to reduce the harms from climate change and to reduce as much as possible our contributions to the climate crisis.
I want to acknowledge several comments in the chat about the environmental costs and the waste associated with producing renewable energy technologies. And I think there's a violent agreement among us all that energy efficiency and demand response and reducing consumption has to be a core part of the decarbonization strategy. So thank you for that, Vic, and for all the folks online who really agree with that. All sources of energy come with trade-offs and impacts. Nothing does not. So I think we're all in agreement there. I have one last question just about cost. Kaylee, and I'm going to put this to you. Vic mentioned that big nuclear facility in Georgia that came online this summer. The price tag was something like $35 billion. It was at least 7 years behind schedule. The cost overruns were ghastly, as were the time overruns. Some say that nuclear, absent federal insurance guarantees, is completely uneconomical, that no private financier would touch it. I'm curious about the economics of nuclear going forward here, and if you really think that some of these SMR and 4th generation facilities are going to be delivering costs per kilowatt hour that even make sense in a world where wind and solar costs are continuing to fall.
Yeah, this is another great question. And I will preface this by saying I am an engineer and not an economist. But from what I am aware of with the economics of nuclear reactors, we know Plant Vogtle in Georgia, very, very expensive, as Elizabeth kind of reiterated there. One of the reasons we are sort of assuming or looking into and digging into and trying to understand why things got so out of hand and why things were so expensive. Something we as engineers do is try and focus on that in the industry. And one of the things that's kind of been dug into a little bit more is understanding this first of a kind of problem. So the reactor that was built in Georgia, Plant Vogtle, was the first AP1000 Westinghouse nuclear reactor to be built in the United States. With the first of a kind of any technology, we see all kinds of things go wrong that we weren't expecting on paper. And as a result, that slows things down. And because nuclear has the risks attached to it that it does, interest rates on loans are significantly higher for those investing in nuclear. So when we see timelines shift and things start to take longer and things go wrong and we run into problems, we see this interest rate tacking on more and more and more money, not to mention more money for things that went wrong that need to be fixed. Westinghouse, I believe it was Westinghouse that constructed this reactor, is working on understanding these, and they should be, I believe, publishing a report sometime in the next year or two about the economics and what went wrong to move forward and try and understand how that can be mitigated in the future. That being said, I'm placing my faith and hope in the small modular and micro reactor designs because they are smaller, less expensive. We don't have to custom make every single massive part one by one.
Economies of scale. Awesome. I'm going to give you each 1 minute to close, and then we're going to pass it over to Fred. This is the first of 3 really terrific conversations, and so Fred is going to share what's next and send us home. Vic, you had the first opening statement, so why don't you take the first close here?
Okay. Apologies ahead if I go over 1 minute. I really appreciate the conversation. I want to make a plug here. Right now, Sierra Club Massachusetts, one of our main priorities for this session is putting solar power where it needs to be, where it isn't already. We call it disturbed lands. If you think about all the empty rooftops and landfills, et cetera, all the land that's already developed that doesn't have solar yet, that is where we need to put it. And we haven't in America, or frankly anywhere in the world, seen what an energy grid looks like when you really do put solar everywhere. I think nuclear is a really great topic that is worth engaging on a technological basis. But like I said before, my focus is on the climate crisis and what we can do right now. We don't live in a world where we have the political power to respond to the climate crisis in a commensurate scale. And we don't live in a world where we have the political power or will to fix all of the policy issues that it would take to create a safe environment for nuclear energy. So I think as we continue to operate in this field, as all of you join us in our activism, I would love to build the political power together to talk about solutions to climate change. I think that we should really think about what is the short-term action that we can take and what is the long-term research and development that we can do. I don't see these as conflicting. But I do think that if we take resources away from technology that's being implemented today and solutions that don't take new technology, like reducing our energy use, being smarter with land use, having people live closer to where they work and where they play, we can make huge leaps and bounds in the climate crisis and in our social resilience, which will help us respond to the challenges of the climate crisis. So yeah, I hope all of you can join us in that fight and we can work together on creating that world.
Well said, Vic. And if you can drop your social media handles or contact or website or any contact information you'd like to share in the chat so people can follow up with you if they'd like to get involved, please do. I'll drop my Twitter in as well. Kaylee.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for having me here. I don't have an organization to plug because I am a grad student, but I am very grateful to have communicated with you all tonight. And I will say, at the end of the day, we need a solution to climate change, right? And as Vic mentioned, there are short-term solutions, there are long-term solutions that require research and development. I personally believe, after witnessing all the technologies that are under development, all the technologies that are being implemented now, from purely the scientific aspect, nuclear makes the most sense. Now, there are a lot of other things that come into play, political aspects, social aspects, economic aspects that need to be accounted for. But I think the first step is having this conversation. I think moving forward, we need to have these open dialogues where we can speak freely about the technologies that we believe in and ways that we can problem solve and work together to develop even better solutions and really innovate our carbon-free electrified future. So in the interest of time, I will stop talking and drop my information in the chat. But thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Kaylee, and best of luck with your studies.
Thank
Fred.
you.
Okay, terrific. Before you leave, a quick announcement about the upcoming webinars in the series. On Wednesday, September 20th at 7:30, we'll be presenting Green Banks, Financing Climate Solutions, an informative discussion about green banks on the national level, the workings of an actual green bank, and the plans for the new green bank in Massachusetts. Then on Thursday, September 28th at 7:30, we will present Creating Sustainable Systems, Soil, Carbon, and Food, which will highlight some of the technical, economic, and political challenges and opportunities for making nature-based climate strategies work at scale. And the link to the overview page for all of this should be in the chat. If not, you will be receiving a follow-up email with all the information, including the links for the Sierra Club and the Twitter handles, etc. That email will also include a link to the recording of tonight's webinar. And I thank everyone who attended tonight for this really terrific discussion. And finally, my thanks to tonight's truly awesome panelists and moderator. You were just terrific, and I thought it was a wonderful give and take. Thanks to the folks behind the scenes who worked to make this series a reality. And finally, thanks to Larry Rosenberg for his inspiration. I'm Fred Hewitt. Good evening to all.